You are unmuted.
Thank you, Your Honor. With that, defense rests.
Okay. Jurors, that is the evidence in this case. After all these weeks, that's the evidence that you will hear in this case. The lawyers and I still have work to do for tomorrow. But tomorrow morning, we will have closing arguments of counsel. They'll get an hour apiece to be able to argue this case to you. I'll instruct you on the law, and then 12 of you will begin your deliberations sometime tomorrow. Okay, so with that, please do not discuss this case with anyone. Don't do any independent research or investigation into this case. If you happen to see, hear, or read anything about this case, please disregard it. Let us know. We'll see you tomorrow.
All rise for the court, please. Sir, follow me, please.
Welcome back to Fair and Square Files, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us once again today as we continue to bring you the latest updates on this riveting trial, Karen Read case. In a significant development, and I mean significant, the defence has rested its case after calling 3 witnesses on Monday. This moment marks a crucial turning point in the proceedings. Throughout the 2 months trial, prosecutors arduously presented evidence from the scene. In contrast, the defence called only a handful of witnesses over 2 days, but effectively used their time to cross-examine prosecution witnesses, raising questions about the investigation, including conflicts of interest and sloppy police work. The defence's strategy appeared to be focused and efficient. By honing in on the most critical points and avoiding unnecessary questions, they aim to make a strong impact without overcomplicating their case. This move shows confidence, and after following this case closely for the last few months, it's easy to see why. This video features the important testimony and cross-examination of defense witness Dr. Frank Sheridan, a retired doctor specializing in forensic pathology. His insights are expected to illuminate critical aspects of the case. And they certainly do, in my opinion. Right, before we go any further, if you haven't already, if you could hit the old red subscribe button, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Court is such to
All right, go right ahead, Ms. Little, in a loud voice.
Thank you. And Dr. Sheridan, I'll ask you to also just keep your voice up for this question.
I'll try.
Assume the decedent was standing with his arm outstretched like this and was struck by the rear of an SUV, only in his arm at 24 miles per hour. Are the injuries in Exhibit 19 consistent with that scenario?
No, I do not think so.
Can you describe that?
Well, as I think I've already mentioned before, one thing that's not there, that should be there, given that idea, that scenario, is there should be bruising, at least bruising, if not perhaps even more than that, but bruising for sure. Secondly, the appearance of these injuries, their pattern, if you want to just call it that, the way they're distributed doesn't seem to fit the idea of the rear of a vehicle being the impacting object.
And at 24 miles per hour, would you expect to see fractures or breaks in the arm?
You could do. There'd be other factors involved as to it would depend on a lot of things, but it's possible, yeah.
I'd like to direct your attention to the injury that Mr. O'Keefe sustained to his head. Do you recall that injury?
To the head?
To the head.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
Could you describe that injury for the jury?
Well, there were a few minor injuries on the face, but the major injury, and indeed the main cause of death, was an impact to the back of the head, slightly to the right of the midline of the back of the head, and where there was a laceration. A laceration is another type of blunt force trauma, but this is a laceration is where the skin is actually opened up or it's split, so you get bleeding from a laceration. So there was a laceration, as I said, in the back of the scalp, in what's called the occipital area, and beneath that, when the skin was moved away as part of the autopsy, there was extensive bruising, hemorrhage, in other words, in the scalp at that same point. There was a fracture that started at that point in the skull, but traveled all the way forward to the frontal areas of the skull. So you have the impact. The impact site is clear because, as I said, you've got the laceration. That's where the impact was. So you have the impact with the scalp hemorrhage there, and the skull fractures. Then the brain itself it had injuries, significant injuries. First of all, there was bleeding on the surface of the brain. And that's very common in situations like this. But in addition to that, there were extensive bruises. Contusions is the real word, actually, but they are essentially bruises of the brain substance itself. And that they were in several different parts of the brain, including the frontal areas, which are near the forehead, and also the temporal, which are towards the side, more or less. And then there was also hemorrhage deep inside the brain in the ventricles, which are open areas in the center of the brain. All of these things were described in the neuropathology report, and you can see them in the photographs that were part of the neuropathology report as well as the autopsy. Because of, as a result of, I should say, the injury to the brain began to swell, and that's what it usually does after major trauma. And as a result of the swelling, you had what's called herniation, where the brain, if you want to think of it this way, the brain is trying to expand, but it can't because the skull is around it. So it begins to put pressure, pushing, especially downwards towards the top of the spinal cord. And eventually, as happened in this case, it's quite clear from the photographs, the brain herniated downwards, the brainstem particularly herniated downwards, and this would have been the final straw, so to speak. That's what would lead to respiratory failure and death. So this was a fatal injury for certain.
And what impact would that type of injury have had on the individual after sustaining it?
Yeah, once this injury occurred, once this impact occurred, Mr. O'Keefe would have been unconscious. He would still be capable of breathing for a while until that brain swelling took over and pushed the brainstem down. But he would immediately from the point of impact, he would have been unconscious, for sure.
Would he have been able to stand up, move, or walk?
No, he would have been unconscious completely.
Do you have any opinion regarding whether that injury is consistent with having been struck on the ground on dirt or grass?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
I'll rephrase it. That was a poorly worded question. Is that injury consistent with striking dirt or grass?
Like, for example, falling onto grass?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. If there's a fall involved here, and there could be, it would be onto a hard surface. But the grass, and as I understand from all the material I reviewed, there was also some snow, and so that might even cushion the impact even a little bit more. But even without the snow, grass is basically too soft for somebody falling and hitting their head on it to get the injuries I've just described.
In addition to focusing on the injuries that were present, what significance do you place on the absence of injuries in conducting an autopsy?
What significance do I put on what?
In addition to focusing on the injuries that are present, what significance do you place on the absence of injuries when conducting an autopsy?
Well, as you put it there, it's a rather general question, but I mean, when you're doing an autopsy, you obviously want to see what is there and what's not, and everything can be relevant, including absent things. Now, in this particular case, there are a number of features of things that are absent that are important. I've already alluded to one, and that is on the arm. If that was an impact from a vehicle, I would expect bruising. But do you want me to continue?
Yes.
Yeah. But if Mr. O'Keefe was struck with, it depends obviously what part of the body is theoretically involved. But if a vehicle hits you, whether it's the back of the vehicle or the front, you're going to have, as long as it's not going extremely slowly, if it's going at any speed at all, any significant speed, it's going to cause at least bruising. And that in this particular case, one of the things that struck me was that there was a distinct absence of bruising on the torso. There was the chest, abdomen, hips, whatever. And also, in most cases that I've ever been involved in where a pedestrian was hit by a vehicle, there were injuries on the legs, including fractures, which are very common on the legs. So the absence of all of these things in this case, I think, is important.
Have you conducted autopsies involving individuals who were involved in fights or altercations?
Yes, many, many times.
Approximately how many?
Gosh, I have no idea, and it's but a lot. I mean, I've done. I said earlier that between over 12, maybe 13,000 total autopsies. Of those, I'm only giving you estimates here, but over 1,000 would have been homicides. Of those, probably maybe a fifth, or about 200, would have involved blunt force trauma instead of, for example, a firearm or something like that. And in those cases, and of course, so all of those, and other cases involving sharp force, homicides involving sharp force may have evidence of a struggle as well. So it's in the hundreds, yeah.
In your expert medical opinion, are Mr. O'Keefe's injuries consistent with a fight or a physical altercation?
In a general sense, they can be. They could be, yes. He had, I alluded to it just briefly before, but the head injury, the major head injury I've described, but he also had a laceration over his right eyelid. He had some scrape marks on his face. He also had some bruises on the back of his right hand, which that kind of injury on the hands can be what we call a defensive injury. In other words, an injury that occurs when you're protecting yourself and you're hit hit either with another fist or with a hard object, and you're protecting yourself. So I would say that some of these findings I've just mentioned are consistent with the possibility of a physical altercation, yes.
Thank you. If I could have one moment.
Sure.
No further questions.
Okay, Mr. Wells?
Thanks, John.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Injuries that you were just testifying about with regard to Mr. O'Keefe, they were on his right knee, his right arm, as well as the back right side of his head. Is that correct?
Yes, I forgot to mention the knee, but yes, there were injuries in those places, yes.
And understandable, but this isn't an autopsy you performed yourself, correct?
I did not perform myself, no.
You never saw the body. You're looking at photographs and reports, correct?
Yeah, I'm going by the photographs and the autopsy report, yes.
And contained within the materials that you reviewed, did you ever look at Mr. O'Keefe's medical records from the Good Samaritan?
Look at whose medical records, Mr. O'Keefe's?
Yes.
I looked at the medical records from Good Samaritan Hospital where he was pronounced dead, yes.
Okay, so you did look at those as well?
I did look at those, yeah. I thought I mentioned it earlier. Maybe I forgot.
Now, with regard to what you reviewed of Mr. O'Keefe's injuries, you saw no injuries to his left arm, correct?
To his left arm? No, I don't think so. No.
No injuries to his left leg, correct?
No.
Injuries to his torso that you saw?
That's correct.
And no injuries to the back left side of his head, is that correct as well?
That's correct, yes.
Now, you indicated that you observed or reviewed the autopsy reports as well as autopsy photographs and the death certificate, correct?
I did, yes.
Now, do you agree with Dr. Scortibello's determination as to the cause of death being multiple blunt force type injuries in conjunction with hypothermia?
I do agree with her, yes.
And you reviewed also the neuropathology report by Dr. Stonebridge?
I did, yes.
And do you agree or concur with the findings of Dr. Stonebridge contained within that report?
Yes, there were photographs taken during the neuropathology examination, which were independent confirmation for me of the things described in the report. Yes.
Now, with regard to autopsies that you performed in the past, well, let me ask you this first. As far as the injuries that you observed in the photographs to Mr. O'Keefe's right arm, they were not the cause of Mr. O'Keefe's death, correct?
No, they were not.
With regard to autopsies that you performed in the past, in regard to there being some sort of animal involved, as you were testifying before, is it normal to see just injuries related to an animal attack on just one portion of one piece of the body?
Yes, in a general way. I mean, as I mentioned, I think when I was answering the question about the cases I've done involving animals, I tried to divide them into two groups because there's an important difference. Some of those cases were cases where the animals were responsible for the death itself. As I said, a bunch of feral dogs in one case, particularly that I remember. Another was a case where it wasn't a whole bunch of them, but there were two dogs, large dogs, and they killed the victims' children. So those individuals had multiple injuries, including deep bite marks that were fatal, particularly in the neck area. But they also had, and I'm stretching my memory a bit because it's a while since I did these cases, but I do have a general recollection that in in those cases, I should say, in addition to the fatal injuries, there were also some non-fatal sort of things like paw marks. And I can't remember the distribution, though, on the body.
Do you remember, as far as whether or not these injuries that you observed in not taking the child fatalities with the dog's maul, I'm presuming that those involved injuries to significant and extensive parts of the body. Is that correct?
Yeah, those are the ones where the animals caused the death, yes.
So in the other instances that you were talking about, do you recall even whether or not those injuries that you observed were ante-mortem or post-mortem?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last part.
The other ones that you were talking about as far as the other animal attacks that you've seen,
Yeah.
do you recall whether or not the injuries that you observed in those instances were ante-mortem or post-mortem?
Oh, ante-mortem. Well, actually, in one of the cases that comes to mind, the marks appeared to be post-mortem, and that was this person was actually a homicide victim, and they were lying outdoors, and their own dog. This was according to police, though, who came on the scene. When they arrived, there was a dog that turned out to be the victim's own dog, was pawing at the body, but the person was dead. But in another case that I can think of, the scratch marks from dog paws were ante-mortem. And they were confined to one place only. I'm trying to remember what part of the body. This case, I had to testify later on. In this case that I'm thinking of now, the paw marks were limited to just one location. I can't remember exactly where they were, though. Whether it was the leg or the arm, I can't remember.
And that was post-mortem injuries that you're talking about there, correct?
No, in the second case here, they were ante-mortem. So in other words, there's been post-mortem and ante-mortem, yes.
The injuries that you observed on Mr. O'Keefe's arm were to the posterior part of his arm, correct?
Yes, basically, the posterior.
No injuries that you observed on the anterior portion or the other side of the right arm, correct?
That's correct, yes.
No other injuries that you observed consistent with what you're talking about as far as an animal attack on any other part of Mr. O'Keefe's body, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And from what you observed in the reports and the photographs, you can't say definitively what type of animal, correct?
That's correct, I can't.
And you can't say even if it was an animal or was a dog, what breed of dog that was, is that correct?
No, but if I had to try, and if I said it,
Not asking you to try, sir. I'm just asking whether or not you can say whether or not that, what breed of dog it was.
no, I can't tell you what breed, no.
You can't say whether or not those injuries were inflicted inside a house or outside of a house, is that correct?
Yeah, I have no idea.
You can't say when they occurred, correct?
Only that they were when he was still alive, yeah. But other than that, no. And they are fresh looking. I mean, in this generally, so they look like that they happened very shortly before death.
And when you say a short time, you're talking about hours?
Minutes to hours, I would say.
Minutes to hours, but you can't.
I mean, I'm talking just based on the injuries themselves alone, leaving anything else out. You can't time injuries as exactly as you might think from CSI or one of these television programs, but they are generally fresh for sure. And but just looking at those on their own, I would have to say minutes to hours, yes.
Now, at some point, were you given or did you review any files from a lab at the University of California, Davis?
I'm not sure. In relation to what?
So are you aware that the State Police Lab in Massachusetts swabbed areas of the sleeve on the right arm of Mr. O'Keefe and sent samples from that in the areas of where the injuries occurred on his right arm, and then sent that to a lab at UC Davis? Are you aware of that?
I'm not sure that I remember that, no.
And so you're equally unaware then that when that was tested, there was no canine DNA found from any of those swabbings in the area where the injuries that you're describing as scratch marks or bite marks occurred?
I wasn't aware of that. I must have missed it.
Are you aware of any sort of bite history or a specific animal at 34 Fairview being involved in attacks on other dogs?
I'm sorry, I don't think I understood that question.
Were you aware that there was a dog that resided at 34 Fairview Road?
Am I aware that there was a dog there?
Yes.
I was informed there was, yes.
Were you also informed that that dog, months later, after January 2022, was involved in an incident in which it attacked another dog, humans intervened, and one of the humans was bitten?
No, I didn't know that.
Were you aware that there were photographs of an actual bite mark from that actual dog months after January 29th? Were you shown any of that?
No, I don't believe I was.
Now, sir, did you write a report in relation to what you observed or anything in regard to your opinion or your testimony that you're testifying to here today?
I didn't write a report as such, but I signed a declaration early on in my involvement in this case.
And that was a declaration or an affidavit that you signed under the pains and penalties of perjury back on January 31st, 2023. Is that correct?
Sorry, what did you say about that?
When you're talking about a declaration, you're referring to an affidavit that you filed with the court under the pains and penalties of perjury in January of 2023.
I didn't think it was January, but however, I thought there was only one, so whatever you have.
Now, at any point in time were you made aware that there were microscopic pieces of the defendant's tail light as small as 1/16 of an inch by 1/16 of an inch that were found in Mr. O'Keefe's clothing?
Objection.
I'll allow it.
That were found in Mr. O'Keefe's what?
Mr. O'Keefe's shirts.
I don't remember that specifically.
And that those pieces were then found to be consistent with the defendant's tail light.
Like I said, I don't remember that particular part.
Were you ever shown any material indicating that there was DNA from the defendant's tail light housing that was consistent with
I asked about that myself, but I think the answer I got was no.
Now, were you ever told about a piece of human hair that was found on the right rear quarter panel near the area where there was a dent on the back right of the defendant's vehicle?
No, I don't remember that.
But then you weren't also told that that was then sent out for mitochondrial DNA testing, and it was consistent with that of Mr. O'Keefe to a degree of 99.895%.
You're talking about a hair sample now. Yeah. No, I didn't have that. Mm-hmm.
Now, doctor, would you agree that in blunt impact injuries, the characteristics of a blunt object can then be transferred to the victim in the form of pattern abrasions that match the characteristics of that blunt object?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, of the photographs, you reviewed photographs of the scene, photographs of the vehicle, is that correct?
Yes, I did. Mm-hmm.
You're aware that there were a number of different pieces of the defendant's taillight that were photographed as well. Did you ever see those?
I did, yes. Mm-hmm.
Do you recall seeing any piece of a clear plastic taillight piece that was recovered on January 29th, along with Mr. O'Keefe's sneaker that had dimpling on the outside of that clear piece of plastic?
I can't. I remember seeing the pictures of the glass fragments, but I don't remember any more specifics than that.
Do you know what a compression abrasion is?
What?
Compression abrasion.
Yeah, although it's not a term we use all the time, but however, yes.
And a compression abrasion can occur when there's direct pressure from a blunt object together with slight rubbing movements that produce skin and epidermal crushing. Is that correct?
Yeah, you have to have some lateral movement as well, though, to get an abrasion.
Now, when you were talking about prior autopsies that you've done involving pedestrian collisions, is it fair to say that most of those pedestrian collisions that you were doing autopsies on involved pedestrians being struck by the front of the vehicle?
Yeah, mostly the front. Mm-hmm.
So mostly it's a pedestrian sort of crossing the street or standing in the street who's then struck by the front of the vehicle, correct?
Yeah, I think they were all. I have actually done a couple of cases where children were hit by the back of a reversing vehicle. This was in the days before they had the rear videos on cars that they have now. But so those cases were impacts against the back of the vehicle. But most pedestrian cases, yeah, are, as you say, they're the front of the vehicle hitting the person.
Just briefly on that, as far as the defendant's vehicle itself, are you aware that there were rear backup cameras and a 360-degree overhead view from the back of her vehicle?
I remember reading that, yes.
Now, understanding what you're talking about as far as a rear vehicle pedestrian collision, is that typically sort of the wear on the vehicle? Let me ask you this first. When you are doing an autopsy in relation to a pedestrian collision, much of the information that you're gaining about that is what you receive from the investigating agency, whether it's the police or something like that, correct?
It varies a lot from one case to another. Sometimes you get no or virtually no information about the accident. Because some of these cases I've done, some of them were witnessed, and some weren't. Let's put it that way. Yeah. So when they weren't witnessed, and when the person was just found later or sometime afterwards, you wouldn't have necessarily any. The vehicle would typically not be there. These would be hit and run type situations. And so in those cases, you wouldn't have all that kind of information. So it varies. It varies.
And understanding that it varies, but primarily what I'm saying is whatever information as far as the body comes in and you're going to conduct an autopsy, there would be some information from law enforcement or witness statements or something as to what type of death this is, as far as gunshot wound, stabbing, pedestrian collision, something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. But like I said, in those unwitnessed cases of pedestrians, I might be given the information that it's probably a pedestrian fatality from a car.
And when it comes to pedestrian collisions, and most of which that you've seen are, again, from the front of the vehicle striking a pedestrian on the roadway, is that correct?
Yeah.
And are you familiar with what role sort of the center of mass of that person versus the center of mass of where they're struck plays in reference to their injuries?
Yeah, it could be that can have a big effect on how the body reacts to the impact.
So most of the time when you're talking about sort of lower extremity injuries or pelvic fractures or things like that, that's in a frontal collision with the pedestrian, correct?
Most of them were, yeah. I mean, the ones that involved being backed over, and they were children. I can't remember the exact distribution of their injuries, except the vehicle went right over them. I do remember that. But anyway, the answer to your question, maybe I'm wandering in my mind, so can you ask me again?
I think you've answered it. So my next question, sir, is when it comes to the rear end collisions, primarily being children, you would agree with me that they have a lower center of mass than a 6'1", 200 something?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
And so as far as them being run over, they're going to get struck, they're probably going to fall to the ground, and then the vehicle's going to go over, correct?
That's right, yeah.
And so how many autopsies have you conducted in regard to pedestrian collisions where they've been sideswiped by the back of a vehicle?
I can't remember.
Can you remember any?
Not off the top of my head, no.
And so if someone is struck by the right rear portion of a vehicle and then projected away from the vehicle based on speed, based on force, based on whatever, would you then expect to see those same type of pelvic fractures or lower extremity injuries that you talked about with a frontal collision?
Well, it depends on the exact position of the victim at the moment of impact. And of course, it could be a lot of different things. They could be, the victim could be facing the vehicle, they could be sideways on, they could have their back. But you're going to see bruising somewhere in that area, in one of those areas, either on the back, the side, whatever, or the front. I would expect to see bruising, significant bruising.
But as you testified earlier on direct, it's sort of dependent or variable depending on how the victim pedestrian interacted with the vehicle. Isn't that correct?
Yes, but I'd expect bruising for sure. I mean, whether you get fractures and so forth will depend on, or for that matter, internal injuries, depends on a variety of factors. But you're going to get bruising for sure.
You did see bruising on Mr. O'Keefe's right hand, correct?
Yes, a small bruising. It looked like two, possibly three, almost confluent or close together bruises.
Were you aware from the materials that you reviewed that Mr. O'Keefe was last seen sort of on video exiting from a bar at about 12:11 a.m. holding a cocktail glass in his right hand?
I vaguely remember that, yes.
Were you also aware that there were pieces of a cocktail glass with Mr. O'Keefe's DNA on it that were found right in the general vicinity of where his body was found?
That I don't remember.
You talked about a couple of different patterns to the injuries that you observed on Mr. O'Keefe's right arm. So my question for you, doctor, is it your testimony that those, what you're terming as animal bites or scratches, were they caused at one time or multiple times, or how many times are we talking about?
You mean on different occasions?
As far as in, there are multiple abrasions as you've termed them, and you're attributing them to an animal attack, correct?
I think that's the most likely explanation for these, yes.
And so my question is, sir, is that from the dog or the animal or whatever it is scratching Mr. O'Keefe once, more than once, based on what you observed in
Well, it's more than once. When I had the laser pointer here, I think I pointed to roughly, 1, 2, 3, 4 different areas. So it looks like, and you have, maybe there's an additional, the ones on the lower forearm, I should say, are harder to figure out. But it looks like 4, maybe 5 separate.
4 or 5 separate sort of swipes, whether they be with mouth or claws or whatever.
Yeah, that's correct.
And so is it your testimony that it's not possible that Mr. O'Keefe received that from some part of the motor vehicle, or a glass shattering, or shattering from a taillight, or any sort of metal pieces underneath contained within that taillight housing as far as his interaction with the vehicle?
They don't look remotely like that to me.
So it's not possible, is that correct?
In my opinion, no.
You were asked about some questions with regard to the surface of the ground as far as dirt or grass. Are you familiar with what the weather was like at the time that Mr. O'Keefe, you testified earlier, you were familiar that he was found in the snow, correct?
Yes.
Do you know what the temperature was like as far as, my question is this, sir. Understanding cushioning of grass and dirt under normal conditions, but if the ground is physically frozen based on the temperature of outside, would that impact as far as your understanding of the injuries to the back of Mr. O'Keefe's head?
Objection.
No, I mean, even if there was a small coating of ice, I wouldn't change my opinion based on that, no.
I'm not talking about ice, sir. What I'm talking about is the ground itself being physically frozen based on the temperatures outside.
Objection.
Sustained.
Now, as far as the hard surface that you're talking about, would that include asphalt pavement?
Yes, it could.
And as far as those injuries, the speed, if Mr. O'Keefe was struck by a vehicle and was projected away from that vehicle and then struck his head on the ground, would that be sufficient force, in your opinion, to cause the skull fracture on the back of his head?
If all that happened, yes, and onto asphalt or something like asphalt, yes, if that's indeed what happened. But like for other reasons, I don't think that is what happened.
Now, you testified or you asked some questions about your opinion and as to or consistency with the physical altercation. Is that right?
Yes.
And the sort of swelling in Mr. O'Keefe's eyes as far as the ecchymosis is concerned there, that was related to the brain injury. Is that your understanding?
Well, the skull injury rather than the brain.
Skull injury, which leads to the bleeding of the brain, which then leads to the swelling of the eye. Right?
Well, yeah, but no, I mean, let's be clear about this. I mentioned the fractures earlier on that came from the back and went all the way towards the front of the skull, including what are called the orbital plates, which are the bones, the parts of the frontal bone that are right over the eye sockets. And the bone there is very delicate. It's the thinnest part of the skull. Anyway, the photographs and the autopsy report clearly show that the fracture involved that on each side, both orbital plates, in other words. And it's that fracture, it's not the brain itself, but it's that fracture which leads to the bleeding that causes the black eyes, if you want to call them that way.
And as far as what your review of the medical records, your review of the autopsy report, photographs, things like that, you observed nothing as far as fractures to Mr. O'Keefe's eye sockets, correct?
Well, the orbital plates, in a sense, are part of the eye sockets, but they're the roof.
Were there any fractures to the orbital bones?
There were no fractures that appeared to be coming from the front, no.
As far as the sclera, was there any broken blood vessels or anything that you observed in either the notes or the reports or the photographs or anything else that you saw?
Broken blood vessels were?
The sclera.
Huh?
Sclera of the eyes? You know what that is?
Oh, the eye, yeah. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear. I just couldn't hear what you said, yeah. No, as far as I know, the eyes were clear, yeah. The eyes themselves were clear, yeah.
Now, as far as the minor injuries that you were talking about, as far as the eyelid or the nose, as far as those minor lacerations you were talking about, there was no bruising around any of those lacerations, correct?
The eyelid laceration, don't forget, is in the same area where you have the other injury, and it's a little bit hard to figure out whether how much hemorrhage, how much of that black eye could even be from related to the laceration, because you've got two possible explanations for the black eyes. One is the skull fracture I've already mentioned, but that doesn't rule out his getting an impact as well on the front, but there's no way you can separate them.
But as far as around those minor lacerations that you're talking about, you didn't observe or see any record of any bruising or any broken bones in those areas whatsoever?
No, well, the main one that I was relating to when I spoke about the altercation question was the laceration on the eyelid. That's not related to the head injury that we've been discussing. So it's a separate injury, and it is from some kind of blow to the front.
The minor lacerations that you observe, would they be consistent with being struck by broken pieces of glass or broken pieces of broken sharp pieces of plastic?
If it was indeed a laceration, as it was described, then no, because lacerations by definition, although this is a term that's often misused, by the way, even by some doctors, but a laceration by definition is an open wound caused by blunt force, not sharp.
So blunt force, as far as what I'm asking is it possible that the lacerations to his face were caused by a blunt object that then shattered and caused the lacerations to his face?
I find that hard to imagine. I find that very hard to even conceive of.
So it's not conceivable? Is that what you're saying?
To me, no.
And from your review of whatever reports and medical records and everything else, what, if anything, did you see? Or did you see anything that had to do with an animal being present on scene or an animal being near Mr. O'Keefe's body or Mr. O'Keefe being inside the house?
I don't know. I mean, but I heard there was an animal somewhere around the place, a dog. I think you mentioned the dog earlier.
So somewhere around the place, but no evidence that you've seen that animal interacted with Mr. O'Keefe in any way?
No, I wasn't there, obviously, and all I can say is what I've already said, but I don't know any more than that.
I know you weren't there. What I'm saying is, from the material that you reviewed, was there any indication or any evidence of that animal ever being near, close to, or interacting in any way with Mr. O'Keefe?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
I'd love to further.